The identity of the Watcher has finally been revealed, so let's talk about it. Welcome back to Now Let's Be Honest. My name is David Tate, and today we are going to be talking about The Chosen Season 5, Episode 6, which is the first episode in The Chosen Last Supper Part 3, which is Episode 6, 7, and 8, which is currently in theaters at the time that I am recording this. This is not my in-depth official breakdown of the episode. That's going to come later on whenever the episodes are available on streaming, and I can actually edit some clips in here and stuff like that. This is simply me walking through the plot based off of some notes that I have on my phone, and we're just going to kind of have a very casual discussion where I'm just going to share some of my initial thoughts, and then we're just going to move along, right? And so if you want a more in-depth, comprehensive breakdown, that's going to come in the form of a bunch of videos later on once it's available on streaming. And before we actually hop into the plot breakdown itself, I do want to just share my general thoughts about these 3 episodes from a really a non-spoilery perspective. And this is mainly if you haven't seen my short where I just kind of gave an out-of-theater reaction. I did post that as soon as I got out of the theater. But now that I've had more time to think about these episodes, I have a little bit better of an opinion about it. The way that I would rank these, just if I'm breaking it down into Last Supper Parts 1, Part 2, and Part 3, I would say that this one falls right in the middle for me, to where I think that these 3 episodes are stronger than the first 2 episodes, but I don't think that they in any way really compare to the middle 3 episodes, right? So I would say the episodes 1 and 2 to me are probably the weakest episodes of this season. And then I would say that these 3 episodes, episodes 6, 7, and 8, land in the middle. And then episodes 3, 4, and 5 to me, I say that not only are those the best of the season, but I would actually argue that those 3 episodes in particular are some of the best episodes of The Chosen in general. Whereas, I hate to say this, I think that the bottom 5 episodes here, episodes 1, 2, and then 6, 7, and 8, I think that they're some of the weaker episodes of the show. And while I say that, I do think that the distance between episodes 1 and 2 and then episodes 6, 7, and 8 I feel like it's pretty vast, right? Because I think that episodes 1 and 2, the more I've had to sit with them, I think they're decent episodes. They're not bad episodes. I really don't think that there are any bad episodes other than my least favorite episode being The Chosen Season 4, Episode 3. That episode, I'm just not a big fan of, but really it's just because of the events that happened at the very end of that episode with Rayma's death. But by and large, I have liked every single episode of The Chosen. And so even whenever I say the episodes are the weakest, I'm not saying they're bad episodes of television. There are some, like even my favorite TV show, Smallville, which you see literally right here. I would say that out of the 200 episodes in that show, there are a bunch of them that are just bad episodes. Whereas in The Chosen, there haven't been any bad episodes, but there have been weaker episodes. And I would say that these 3 episodes, in my opinion, they're not the weakest, but there are some pacing issues and some structural issues to me that do bump it down a little bit. I really liked how they adapted the biblical material, and I thought it was really creative. But if you're simply analyzing it from an artistic perspective, I think that's where you begin to see some of the chinks in the armor, if that makes sense, right? Whereas I would actually say that the way that they adapted a lot of the biblical material, I think they did a really good job. And that for that reason, I really liked these 3 episodes that we saw in The Chosen, like in Last Supper Part 3. I really do like the episodes themselves, but whenever you're analyzing them as individual episodes, they fall short a bit. And this is something that I addressed very early on. Whenever I got out of Part 1, I addressed the fact that this season was probably going to be the weirdest season of the show, mainly because of the timeline constraints that they're facing, right? Because for the first 4 seasons of the show, while we were heading eventually to the cross, they had a lot more flexibility in what they could do because they weren't stuck on a fixed timeline. And whenever we get to season 6 and they are detailing the events of the crucifixion, while that is constrained to 24 hours, the fact that they have 8 episodes to stretch that out means that they can do a lot of creative things with it, and I think they're going to have a little bit more freedom in exactly how they tell that story. Whereas this season in particular, being Holy Week, there were certain narrative beats they had to hit in certain chronological time like things that they had to check off, that I think that it probably constrained the writers a little bit. And I think they did the best with those constraints. I really don't know how I would have handled it better. Unless maybe, and I'll address this probably not in today's episode, but whenever we talk about the next episode, I think that maybe these 3 episodes would have been formatted better if they had been split not into 3 episodes, but maybe 4 episodes. But even then, there were some issues in regards to like, I don't really know how you would split that, right? And so those are my general thoughts here, to where I think that these 3 episodes are good when you're just considering the stuff that is in the show, right? Like if this season were just one long, like 8-hour movie, I actually think that it almost stands better than it does as 8 individual episodes, right? And so that's where I'm more reflecting on that from an artistic perspective. Obviously, each episode should feed into the next, but you also kind of want to judge each episode individually. And I think that's where I have some hesitations in regards to it. But I really did like the creative stuff they did in these episodes. And it's probably the most creative and even mystical that the show has ever gotten. And I genuinely was not expecting that at this point in the show, right? I would have actually expected some of the more mystical stuff to happen during Christ's like primary ministry. And then like, then they kind of like start taking some of that stuff, not taking it out, but focusing less on it during this portion. But they actually leaned into it, and I thought that was really cool. And so I'm excited to talk about those things. But those are my just general thoughts. That being said, let's actually get into the plot breakdown itself, just in particular of episode 6. We'll talk about episode 7 and 8 later on this week. But for right now, let's just talk about episode 6. And like all the other episodes, just in case I have to warn you, spoiler alert in 3, 2, 1, let's get into it. Like the other episodes, this episode opens up with a Last Supper scene. And we open up with Thomas saying, what is that supposed to mean? Who is and who isn't? And whereas the other scenes in the episode, you were able to kind of begin to pick up what exactly the original context was here. Whenever you get to this scene, you're like, ooh, okay. Things seem to be tense, and you're wondering why people are responding the way that they're responding. And then it takes a little bit longer to piece together what exactly just occurred, right? Jesus turns to them, and he does say something that is straight out of Scripture. He says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you. And then he reveals to them that this is going to be the last Passover he eats with them until the arrival of the new kingdom, right? And all of them are kind of, they're listening to this, and they don't really have a strong reaction to his words right here. But that's because, as we've seen throughout the season, he's been saying stuff like this all along. And so while they are troubled by it, it seems like they're going to grow more troubled over the course of the meal, like we've seen in previous episodes. Because again, each episode is addressing an earlier moment in the supper, right? And so right here, it just seems like he's saying the same stuff as before. But over the course of the meal, they begin to put together, oh no, he's serious. Like things are about to radically shift. And so over the course of the meal, they get more concerned. It's at this point that we actually get to see the very first communion, where Jesus breaks the bread. He blesses the bread, he explains the Passover significance, but then he points out that this night we celebrate redemption from sin because of me. And he says, this is my body broken for you. He passes it around, and they all eat it together, right? And then he blesses the cup. He also explains the Passover significance, and then he says, tonight, this is my blood of the new covenant. And I don't really have much to say about this other than the fact that this was probably, kind of cool to film, because you're filming the first ever Lord's Supper, right? The first ever communion. And that's kind of cool. I really did like the fact that they explained the Passover significance of these things, right? They kind of explained that this is not Jesus creating something entirely new, but rather he is giving an update to something very old, right? The reason why he says this is the blood of the new covenant is because we are moving from the Mosaic covenant, the old covenant, and the law, and since it is being fulfilled in Christ, we are moving into the new covenant, right? And so the bread and the wine, they have significance from a Passover perspective that Jesus is then adding on to it by being the greater Passover lamb that is about to die, right? I was wondering if they were going, like, I figured they would explain that part of it in the show, and they did. But part of me was also hoping they would further explain some of the deeper imagery going on there. I understand why they didn't, mainly for time constraints, because these opening scenes have already been pretty lengthy. But another thing that is really interesting about the Last Supper is that there's a lot of marriage imagery that is interspersed in here, right? And you see this mainly in the Gospel of John. John is really heavy, like he's very heavy-handed with the marriage imagery that Jesus lays down during this Last Supper. And what's interesting about that is that John actually doesn't detail the first communion, right? He doesn't put that in his gospel because it's already found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But what's cool is that whenever you take the marriage imagery from John's gospel and you look at that over the Last Supper, you actually realize that this is actually a betrothal ceremony as well, right? This is where Christ declares the church his bride, right? And this is basically the betrothal ceremony, which will then be culminated in the wedding supper of the Lamb, which we see at the end of times in the book of Revelation. And so I was kind of hoping that they would kind of talk about that a little bit, but for the sake of time, I think they didn't do that. I'm sure that the writers are aware of that imagery and stuff, but I was kind of hoping they would highlight it. But instead, they mainly emphasize the Passover stuff. Another significant thing worth highlighting here is that Judas is present during this moment. A big debate that people have about the first communion is whether or not Judas was there. Because whenever you read the different gospels detail Judas's departure at different times, right? Because the gospels aren't always speaking strictly chronologically in different places. And so whenever you look at the gospels, there are some which mention Judas leaving beforehand, and there are some which mention Judas leaving after, and we don't know which one it actually was, right? Because it doesn't say, oh, and this happened before and this happened after. And so there's a lot of theological debate over whether or not Judas would have been present here, because in general, Scripture portrays that communion is something that is reserved primarily for believers, right? Well, not primarily, exclusively for believers. Whereas Jesus says, woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man, it'll be better for him to have never been born, which would seem to suggest Judas is not saved. And so people will debate about whether or not Judas was actually present for the first communion, because if so, he would be the one exception to the rule where we actually have somebody being permitted to partake in the body and blood of Christ who is not themselves part of the body of Christ, which would be very interesting. But in the show, they did choose to have Judas present here. And I don't know if they were doing that for theological purposes or because they were just kind of wanting to wait to, like it could just be how it timed out that they decided, you know what, we want to save communion for later on in the season, and we want Judas leaving earlier in the season. And so it could have just been something like that where they just kind of decided to put him there. But it also could be that they made a conscious choice for that. I don't know. So they do all that. And then I thought this was actually clever. They used the passing of the cup to actually serve as the catalyst through which Jesus jumps into some of his other teachings from the Gospel of John, right? Because Jesus says, like, as they are passing around the cup and they're drinking from the fruit of the vine, Jesus begins to say, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Abide in me, and I in you. By this my Father is glorified, that you bear much fruit and prove to be my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my life. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full. And then he begins to weep, right? And I thought this was very clever because we've talked about this, that they're not really necessarily working through a lot of the Last Supper stuff in a strict chronological order, in the same order that we see it in the Gospels themselves. And in particular, the way that John does the Last Supper discourse, which is John chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17, the way that he does that is really just one long discourse, and they have just not followed that strict order. And even like biblically, they've changed a little bit of stuff, because we know at the end of John chapter 14, Jesus says, hey, arise and let's go. And so it seems like he's saying, hey, let's get up and leave the room and let's begin walking to the Garden of Gethsemane. And so most likely John chapters 15 and 16 and going into the prayer in chapter 17, most likely all of that was actually being taught to the apostles by Jesus as they're walking to the garden. And so whenever you get to this portion, whenever Jesus is talking about him being the vine and them being the branches, most likely they were just passing through a vineyard, right? We don't know that, right? That's kind of speculation. But there were plenty of vineyards outside Jerusalem, and it would make sense as they're walking to the Garden of Gethsemane that Jesus would say something along these lines. And so most likely that is how it would have historically happened. But I thought it was cool how they decided, okay, we're going to just have Jesus say this during the actual meal itself, and let's just tie it into them passing around the wine, right? Because, they're passing around wine, and he is using that as a launching point, right? And so I thought that was good. I thought that was really cool. And so Jesus gives all those teachings, and then he begins to weep intensely, but then he begins to smile through his tears as he is staring off into the distance. And Andrew asks Jesus who he is smiling at, and ultimately what we see is that Jesus is looking at an empty seat, which is set at the end of the table. And it's never explicitly said in the episode as far as I can tell, but I'm assuming that this is supposed to be the empty seat of Elijah, right? Because this is just a traditional thing that Jewish people will do. They will leave an empty seat for Elijah. And they did explain that, if you remember way back in season 1, episode 2, whenever Mary was having her Shabbat dinner, They did explain this custom because she had set out an empty seat for Elijah, and they said, no, that's only during Passover. And so this custom was explained in the show. I'm assuming that's what was going on here. What I'm struggling with here, and this is something that maybe upon repeat viewing, I'll pick up on this a little bit more. I'm trying to figure out why it was in this moment he would have been so moved to the point that he's looking at Elijah's place, right? Because I was trying to think what exactly this might entail, other than maybe he's saying that I'm going to depart to be with the Father, and we know that Elijah was taken up in a whirlwind to heaven. I don't fully know. Or maybe he's reflecting on the transfiguration where he talked to Elijah and they had a discussion about these things. The only issue with that is that in the context of The Chosen, that moment never actually happened, right? We never had any references to it, whereas if it had happened, you would definitely expect to have seen it referenced at some point. And so I'm not totally sure why he looked at Elijah's place in this moment. And so if y'all have an answer to that, just maybe let me know. But it seems like that is what he was doing. And then he goes on to speak and he says, earlier I may have washed some of your feet, but not all of you are clean, right? He says, the scripture is now fulfilled. He who has eaten my bread has lifted up his heel against me. Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me, right? And so this is where he finally drops down that bombshell, which has really impacted them for all the scenes that we've seen so far, right? The threat of looming betrayal, or I guess the looming threat of betrayal. That has been a theme in every single one of these scenes, these opening scenes, which has then overall basically had Judas's betrayal been one of, if not the central theme of the entire season. And right here is where it's really introduced, right? And so as we're getting near to the end of the season, Jesus finally lays it down. One of you is going to betray me. And this shocks everybody, right? Peter asks who? He says they'll bind the man, they'll gag him, and he won't do it. And honestly, whenever I heard that, I didn't necessarily interpret it as a joke, but a lot of people in my audience laughed. There were actually a lot of places throughout these episodes where people were laughing quite a bit in what I thought were like inappropriate places. But once they started laughing, I was like, oh, I guess that was kind of funny. I think I was just so invested in like the weight of the moment that I didn't find it funny. Like to me, I was like, well, yeah, that's a reasonable thing. Like if you think that somebody's going to betray Jesus, let's stop in there and let's stop him. So I was more just like being like, yeah, I would see why Peter would say that. But then everybody else was like, ha ha ha, classic Peter, which I guess maybe that was what they were intending us to respond. But then Jesus says, no, the Son of Man goes as it is written, right? He says, no, it has to happen this way. But woe to that man. It would have been better for that man to have never been born. So Jesus says, it has to happen this way, but that does not excuse what this man's about to do, right? He is guilty for his actions, and it would have been better for him to have never been born. And Judas is obviously troubled during all of this. Jesus says that he needs a moment. He gets up and he walks away. The disciples all get up too, and that leads into the opening scene that we had from episode 5, right? Whenever we had, little James and Thaddeus, and they're approaching Jesus, and then Thomas approaches Jesus, and then everybody's debating stuff. So that kind of sets up all that. From here, we cut to the opening credits, and then after the opening credits, we cut to 8 months earlier. And that's because, if you recall, the way that episode 5 ended was with the reintroduction of a fan favorite character, Nicodemus. And so we're going to figure out what Nicodemus has been up to. And we open up with Zebediah leading the Sanhedrin meeting. And Nicodemus is present, but he seems troubled, right? And it's hard to tell if he's falling asleep in the meeting or if he's just sick or if he just honestly is checked out because he's distracted by a bunch of other stuff. But I think it might have been a mixture of all of it, right? He's present at the meeting. And then after the meeting, he's welcomed back. Apparently, he's been traveling in Bethel, right? So we know he is the teacher of teachers. He's going around teaching places. And so just like he went to Capernaum back in season 1, apparently he spent some time in Bethel, and people have known that he's been sick and stuff. And so he's finally just now coming back. He does encounter Shmuel in the court there, and it's a very awkward meeting. You get the impression this is the first time they have seen each other since their last encounter in Capernaum back in season 1. So it's been a few years. They see each other. Very, very awkward. Nicodemus tries to do the right thing. He congratulates Shmuel on entering the Sanhedrin, but then they also share an awkward goodbye as well. Later on, we cut to Zebediah and Nicodemus just like privately meeting up, and Zebediah is giving Nicodemus updates on just the things that have been going on since Nicodemus was in Bethel, right? Just getting up to date. And Nico, he only wants the highlights, right? He does not want all the details. You get the idea that, again, he's either distracted or just weak or still sickly. And so he just wants the highlights. But then Zebediah ends up making a casual comment that really gets Nicodemus' attention, because he mentions that John the Baptist has been put to death. And Nicodemus had not heard of this. And Nicodemus is like, whoa, 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 hold up. What? And Nicodemus explains that, he met with John the Baptist and he thought he was an okay guy and he wasn't really that troublesome. But he is very troubled by John the Baptist's death. And then Nicodemus begins fishing for information. He says, oh, he had like a cousin in Capernaum. And Zebediah admits that he knows exactly who he's talking about. Yeah, he's like, yeah, that's Jesus of Nazareth. That is the most popular or promising Messiah claimant in the land. I don't remember if he said promising or popular there. But he said, yeah, that guy, like he's well known. Everybody thinks he's the Messiah. And Nico, he is overwhelmed by this, right? And he's so overwhelmed by this news that Jesus has taken things by storm that he just dismisses Zebediah. He's like, okay, get out of here. I need to think. And Nicodemus rushes into the other room and he goes and finds nobody other than the Watcher. And he calls him honestly, so we've been speculating about who the Watcher is for so long that I expected the reveal of his identity to be like a bigger deal. But he kind of just like threw his name out there and was like, oh, okay, cool. So he goes in there and he tells Matthias that he has an assignment for him. And so at long last, we have the revelation that the Watcher is none other than Matthias, who, according to Acts chapter 1, will go on to be the 12th apostle. And he will be the ultimate replacement for Judas Iscariot. And so from a thematic level, it's kind of cool that Matthias is introduced here because Judas is going to agree to betray Jesus here. And so we actually have this kind of handing off of the baton. In the very episode that Judas agrees to become the traitor, his replacement is named. That's actually kind of fitting. That being said, I've spent quite some time theorizing about who this person's going to be. And I've, discussed with a bunch of people who they thought it was going to be. And Matthias has consistently been one of the people that was suggested as a potential candidate. And I think early on, I think maybe at the end of last season, I even kind of ran with the Matthias theory. But in my most recent video, literally less than a week ago, whenever I was theorizing about who the Watcher would be, I don't even think I mentioned the Matthias theory. I don't even think I talked about it at all. And that's because, if I'm just being entirely honest, this was the least interesting option to me. Whenever I was theorizing who this guy could be, to me, Matthias seemed too much like the easy answer. And I think the reason why is because of the different people we speculated about, Matthias is really the one that we know least about, right? We had talked about maybe him being Luke, maybe him being Barnabas. I guess the only other person that I'd suggested as a possible candidate that we know even less about would be Caiaphas. I did suggest him, but really we know the same amount about Caiaphas. Honestly, no, we actually know more about Caiaphas than we do about Matthias, because with Caiaphas, we at least know that this guy had a whole long conversation with Jesus, and we know what the conversation was about. Matthias, we literally know practically nothing about, which, to be fair, is also true for most of the 12 apostles. But whenever I was theorizing, to me, I was thinking about just like from an artistic perspective. I was like, okay, I could see how all these different people would be like legitimate candidates for this spot, right? To me, Luke was the one I was leaning towards the most, mainly not because to me chronologically it made sense, and to me it was kind of weird that they might recast another actor, but because they constantly showed him writing stuff down. That seemed like a very strange detail to me. And that did begin to get explained whenever you realize that this is a guy who's been corresponding with Nicodemus. He's been writing stuff down for him. That makes sense. But even then, I didn't think it was going to be Matthias. And again, it's just because to me, that's the most least interesting. And the reason why it's the least interesting to me is because it almost feels a bit like a retcon. It feels to me, and I'm not trying to be too critical here because this is a total, it's a legitimate solution. I'm just trying to explain why to me, it was almost like a deflating revelation. Recently, in between seasons 4 and 5, right, they have announced that they are planning on doing future shows, right? And one of those shows that they're wanting to do is an Acts of the Apostles TV show based on the book of Acts. And so, since in between the seasons, they began to speculate, they announced, hey, we're going to do the show, people began to wonder, well, there's some people you're going to need to introduce who you have not introduced, such as Matthias. And so, to me, I don't know, if they hadn't mentioned that they were going to do the Acts show, I think that I would actually be more encouraged by this revelation. Whereas to me, since we know that they're wanting to do the Acts show later on. To me, it was almost like they're like, oh, crud. If we want to do that act show, we need to introduce Matthias at some point. Well, I guess we should introduce him now. And so, like, it's like, okay. And so you can see how, as they're filming season 4, they're thinking about the act show. They haven't announced it yet. And they're like, let's introduce a guy who's watching stuff so that we can say that he's been present for a lot of Christ's ministry behind the scenes, right? And so, like, to me, I'm like, okay, like, it feels more like a retcon where they're trying to, like, almost, like, fix a plot hole. And I don't know, maybe that was their, like, the writers might respond to this video and they might say, no, this was actually our plan all along and we had planned this. But I would actually probably push back against that, because whenever they first started writing the show, they didn't know how successful this show was going to be, right? And so there's definitely a lot of things they've had to figure out along the way. Whenever they made season 1 of The Chosen, they had no idea that this thing was going to go on for a full 7 seasons and inspire all these other shows. And so to me, I think it is a bit of a retcon where they were just trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we introduce this character now in an easy way? And so that makes sense. But I think a lot of the other theories, to me, I liked more. I liked like the one the one I wanted to happen is I wanted it to be Barnabas, right? I actually thought it would be really cool if this was Barnabas, and I even talked about it in my other video. I thought it would have been really cool if they had made him the rich young ruler, because that would have paralleled the Nicodemus story. But then later on, the rich young ruler becomes, it's revealed that his name is Barnabas, and that he actually ends up going and he does sell his land and he does follow Jesus. And I thought that'd be kind of cool. But they're not doing that. It turns out this is Matthias, and yeah, that's fine with me. Like I said, I think it was probably the least interesting option of all of them, and that's why I didn't really linger on it. But it's a totally fine revelation, and so kind of cool. We now know who the Watcher is. He is Matthias, and he will one day be amongst the ranks of the apostles. And now I just feel like we were reading way too much into all this stuff, because literally none of the stuff we were analyzing could have helped us figure out his identity, because we just know very little about Matthias. And so I was like, okay, other than like, never mind. Yeah, that's good. Anyways, so Nicodemus comes in, he tells Matthias, I have an assignment for you. And ultimately we know what that assignment is. That assignment is that he is going to become the Watcher, which is the name that we've given him, right? He's going to go and he's going to basically spy on Jesus for the sake of Nicodemus. We now cut to the present, and we pick up right where episode 5 left off, with Nicodemus meeting with Mary Magdalene. Mary says that she has needed Nico's help, and he says that her lack of discretion might accelerate Jesus' demise. He asks why Jesus is systematically turning allies into enemies, and he reads Jesus' own words from just a few days earlier. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He says this does not sound like an invitation to join him. And what I did like about this is that this actually helped explain to me some of the issues that I had voiced in previous episodes. Because in the last 3 episodes, Mary Magdalene kept doing things where she's like, I'm going into the city, but we never knew what she was doing. And I had speculated in those previous episodes, I said, I'm assuming that she was simply looking for Nicodemus. But they never said that. And then you end up having her like getting like bound and stuff like that. Like, like she has like a bag over her head and is taking Nicodemus. And I was like, that seems kind of weird. And it just kind of seems like convenient. Oh, the very person you were looking for happened to want you bound. And so they did kind of explain this to where it turns out I was right. Yes, what she has been doing is she was looking for Nicodemus, and it really just was a matter of convenience. They happen to be looking for each other. There's just some kind of weird stuff about this though. Like the practicality of this, it's like a very weird plot point to me, because the idea that you have, I don't know, I feel like Nicodemus' character has changed a little bit in these episodes. And again, I'm not trying to come across too critical. I think that they really wanted this to be a big reveal at the end of episode 5, to where it's like, oh yeah, look, it's Nicodemus. But I think that in hindsight, given the explanations we get in this episode, it seems so strange to me that like all these things had to occur. Like Nicodemus like talks about in this episode that he really wants to keep his like whereabouts a secret, and like where he lives a secret, but I'm not totally sure why, right? I don't get why he wants to keep his location a secret, because like other people know where he lives, right? Like why does he want to keep his location a secret from like Mary Magdalene, right? And like you're telling me that Nicodemus, who's supposed to be this super righteous dude, right? I mean, like the other Pharisees the other religious leaders, they get into sketchy stuff, but you're telling me that Nicodemus, he like was wanting to figure out how to get this woman to his house. And he's like, hey, Matthias, faithful Jew, I want you to grab this woman in the middle of the night and I want you to put a bag over her head and bring her over. That's just weird. It's like, that's a very strange thing to do. And I'm not totally sure why. To me, it seems like they just really wanted to put Mary in a dramatic situation, and they wanted to do that whole bait and switch thing where it looked like maybe she was actually being taken to Caiaphas' house, like we saw at the end of episode 5, and they want to do the big reveal with Caiaphas. And so to me, it almost feels like forced drama. It seems like a very weird thing in the show, like to where like I feel like the explanations that we got in this episode actually make episode 5 work a little bit less, because to me, I'm like, why did you do all those weird things? Like, it feels a little bit unnecessary. But I think it was really because they just wanted a really dramatic ending to episode 5, and they did have a really dramatic ending, but it's one of those places where like the explanation you get later on kind of makes it look weirder, because I'm like, okay, I don't know. I can never see myself being like, hey, I want to have a meeting with somebody, a totally normal meeting, and I'm going to get one of my close disciples who looks to me for counsel in righteousness and wisdom, and I'm going to have them grab a woman in the middle of the night and put a bag over their head and take them to my house in secret. That just sounds sketchy. And it is sketchy. And it's like, okay, I don't know. It's kind of strange. But they end up having this conversation, and Nicodemus's concerns are valid, right? So ignoring all the weird stuff, once you get past that stuff, the conversations they're having here is pretty straightforward. Matthias does admit that he's been tracking them for a while, and Nico tells Mary that she needs to listen. He feels an immense responsibility for the people, and there are a lot of Messiah claimants out there, but when someone like Jesus shows up, he says, I have a sacred duty to prove him wrong. And I think that's an interesting mindset, right? He says that whenever somebody like Jesus shows up, I have to prove him wrong. I could see how somebody from, I could see how this is the mindset of the religious leaders of his day. And so this is actually showing that Nicodemus hasn't totally broken free of the mold of them. But I would say that in general, that's not really what your goal is, right? Your goal should never be to go out of your way to prove somebody wrong. Your goal should be to test their words and their claims by Scripture, right? And so if somebody's out there like going and saying that they have like a prophecy, you shouldn't make it your goal to prove them wrong. You should make it your goal to see whether or not what they're saying lines up with Scripture and what God would say, right? Because if you're wanting to go out to prove something wrong, you can prove anybody wrong, right? I mean, you can try, because you can twist what they've done in order to try to find a way where it's wrong. I mean, somebody says 2 + 2 is 4. I could find a way to prove them wrong. Really what I need to do is I need to assess what they're saying and try to see whether or not it is legitimate. But I could see how from his perspective, that is his goal. So he says, yeah, I have a sacred duty to prove them wrong. Yet whenever Mary questions him about this, Nico admits that Jesus checks all the boxes of the Messiah. And he begins to quote Isaiah, right? He says, the blind see, the deaf hear. He begins to quote the part about those who walk in darkness will see a great light, which is a prophecy about the Messiah being like rising up in Galilee, right? And then they also together, they begin to quote from Micah, right? Nicodemus quotes it, and then Matthias steps in and he finishes the quote talking about Bethlehem Ephrathah. And so what's cool about that is that Nicodemus, on one hand, says that he has a sacred duty to prove these Messiah claimants wrong, but he can't, right? And so that's actually really cool. It's where even when he's trying to prove Jesus wrong, he cannot do it, which tells you that even though he might be blinded in the same way that the other religious leaders are, he is at least more willing to follow where the Spirit leads and to follow where Scripture leads, whereas the other religious leaders, they're not even willing to do that. And so we do see that while he is still part of them, he's not as much like them as like Shmuel or something like that, right? Which is consistent with what we've seen in the show and consistent with what we see in the Bible, right? We know very little about Nicodemus, but this is basically the impression that we get. Nicodemus says that he wanted Jesus to be a fraud, but Matthias says that he's seen too much. And again, this is going to be where we see a parallel between Matthias and Judas, right? And so I can see how now that we know that this is Matthias, there's stuff they do in this episode which is really clever, to where Matthias says, I've seen too much, and later on, Judas is going to say, I've seen too much, but I guess I haven't seen enough, right? And so you can see how Matthias is going to be a fitting replacement for Judas. I just think that's kind of cool. Mary Magdalene asks why they haven't said anything about what they've seen. She says that she's been looking for Nicodemus for help. That's where she explicitly explains, that's why I've been in the city. And it's funny, like you would think that, like, it's weird to me why it took 3 days for her to do this. Because like you would think that she'd be like, hey, where does Nicodemus live? And somebody could have just pointed it out. Like it's not it's not like he's a non-influential person. Like, people would know where Nicodemus lives. And so that's just very strange to me. Because it's not like Nicodemus is in hiding. I don't know. That's strange. But she says she was looking for Nicodemus to help. And Nicodemus says that he was looking for her to warn them about the danger. Which also begs the question, why did it take 3 days for you to get her when she's literally been in the city for the last 3 days, and Matthias is pretty good at finding people? And so, again, I think it's just for the purpose of dramatic tension in the show. Whereas, realistically, this conversation should have happened probably, like, at the end of episode 3. But, again, just for the sake of the show itself, we move along. Mary Magdalene ultimately just says that Jesus is not running from the danger, and therefore they're not running from the danger. Instead, she asks Nicodemus if he can help them from the inside, right? Do whatever you can to just calm people down and try to fix things. Before she leaves, she does stop and she thanks him. He says, "For what?" And she says, "For trying." And she recalls season 1, episode 1, whenever he tried to cast out the demons. And she says, "I know coming to the red quarter didn't go how you had hoped, but look what it led to," right? It led to this moment where both of them have encountered the Messiah and their lives are radically transformed. And he says that her change is just as convincing as the prophecies of who he is, right? Which is pretty cool, right? That's something where every time Nicodemus and Mary have a conversation, which isn't very often, but they always end up dropping these one-liners, which are cool, where he basically says, your testimony and the transformation of Christ's influence in your life, that is just as convincing to me of his messianic claims as the hundreds of prophecies that he fulfills. And that's kind of cool, right? That should be motive in our own life, right? The transformation that people see in us should be a great witness and testimony to the legitimacy of Christ being enthroned as the Messiah. Nicodemus ultimately tells her that he will search the Torah to figure out what is in store for Jesus, right? And so Nicodemus is going to try to put these things together and figure out if the Torah suggests that things like this are going to happen to the Messiah. And with that, Mary leaves. Nicodemus' wife Zohara comes out. She calls him into the study, and she notices that there is something going on with him, and she wants to talk, right? He hasn't been eating. He's still been very sickly. He's constantly studying the scriptures, and he's doing way more research than he typically needs to like perform a sermon, right? She can tell that he is troubled by something. And he says that they will talk, but he says that he can't just yet. And he says, "I am sorry." All right, we cut back from Nicodemus and Matthias. We now cut to Caiaphas and Judas, right? Another pair of, a religious leader with one of the apostles of Jesus, or one of the future, well, I guess you've got a former apostle and a future apostle. Judas is the former apostle and Matthias is the future one. So Caiaphas welcomes Judas in, and Judas yells, he comes in with like guns blazing. He says, "We are not the same." And Caiaphas agrees that he's not the same, and he begins to list out his credentials and begins to deride Judas. Right off the bat, you get the idea that Caiaphas thinks that he is better than everybody. He says, "You're right, we're not the same. I am the high priest. I am the most important person on the face of the planet. I can enter into the Holy of Holies." I would like to think that high priests in Israel wouldn't be this arrogant, but whenever you actually look at the historical context of this time period, it's legitimate, right? The high priesthood was very corrupt at this time period, and it was all about political power. And so, yeah, this guy literally is a wolf in sheep's clothing, where on one hand, he genuinely thinks he believes in God and cares about God, when in reality, if you actually look at his words, you'll see this guy is just in it for himself. And then he begins to just badmouth who Judas is. Judas goes on to say he can deliver Jesus to them, but he believes that Jesus is, quote, most likely the Messiah. And to this, Caiaphas says, "Why?" And this is where Judas says the same thing Matthias had said. He says, "I've seen too much." But then Caiaphas says, "Then why are you doing this?" And Judas says, "I guess I haven't seen enough." And that's where Caiaphas says, hence the most likely, right? So we get the idea that Caiaphas is paying very close attention to Jesus' words and to Judas's words. And he's realizing, okay, yeah, this guy has got some issues with Jesus. Judas says that he hopes, like he basically says, let me just lay my cards on the table here. I hope that Judas will fight back against the captors, overthrow Rome, and claim his throne. He says, that is my goal. He says, I will hand Jesus over to you, but I fully expect he will fight back. But Caiaphas, he says, I don't like your attitude here. I don't like how blunt you're being. You need to mind your manners, young boy. You're in the presence of the high priest. He says he doesn't like being talked to in such a way. And Judas, he begins to leave, right? Like he comes in here and he's trying to, it's funny, he's a businessman, but you gotta get the impression he probably wasn't a very good businessman because he does not understand, he's already, he's not the one in charge here. He thinks he is. He really isn't, right? Him simply showing up there has already communicated to Caiaphas that Caiaphas has won, right? So Judas is trying to act like he is still in control, but he's not in control. And probably deep down, Judas knows this. So Judas gets up, he tries to leave, but ultimately, Caiaphas says that they are not finished. Judas comes back and he just kind of agrees. He says, okay, I am both able and willing. All we must agree on is a price. And here they begin to barter. Caiaphas offers him 20 pieces of silver. Judas begins to laugh. He says, no, I want 40. And then they start to barter their way down. And then Caiaphas basically says 30 final offer, which is the equivalent to 4-month wages. And Judas points out that that is the price of a slave. But Caiaphas, he says that Jesus is nothing but a slave to him. He says he is the only buyer, and Judas says, I am the only seller. Which, again, it's I don't know what point Judas is trying to make here, because Caiaphas isn't looking for another seller. Other than the fact that I guess Judas is still trying to haggle, but there's no more haggling to be done. Caiaphas says that the temple guards can extract information from him. And basically that's where you get the threat, right? He says, my temple guards can do things to you, and they will get this information out of you for free. Consider this mercy. Judas says that he will only hand Jesus over in the absence of a crowd. And Caiaphas, this actually plays, we know this plays exactly into what Caiaphas wanted, right? He didn't want there to be a crowd. But Caiaphas says that he's surprised by this because he thought that Judas would want a crowd in order to spark revolt. But Judas responds and says that if Jesus is not the Messiah, Pilate will brutalize their people, right? So I actually like this explanation, right? I liked how they're fleshing this out to where Judas is yes, I think Jesus is the Messiah and I want him to take down Rome. But you get to see, like Caiaphas is calling him out here, he's a walking contradiction. Because if he wants to overthrow Rome, it really is in Judas's favor that there be a crowd here so that whenever Jesus fights back, it ends up getting Rome involved and they can win. But it being a private thing in the middle of the night, that doesn't really seem to lean towards Judas's favor. But that's where Judas gets to explain, I don't know he's the Messiah, right? I think I'm hesitant, and therefore, if he is not the Messiah, I don't want Rome to get involved and kill our people. And so we get to see, Judas has some major, major doubts. To this, Caiaphas says, you have 24 hours. And as Judas gets up to leave, Caiaphas points out that Judas is the only son of an only son, and he is the final Iscariot. This is the best chance for his family name to be remembered. And with that, Judas leaves. And that's a sad thing. That's going to be something that we see a few times throughout these episodes, is that the idea of the Iscariot family name being remembered. And unfortunately, the name will be remembered, but it will not go down in a good way. It will go down in infamy. All right, so now we cut to Atticus meeting with Caiaphas in the middle of the night. And this is all on Wednesday night, right? And Atticus reveals that he has been watching Caiaphas and his men, who remind him of zealots, but they lack the sophistication and the training of zealots. He says that the zealots, they have precision, which makes them predictable, whereas, honestly, Caiaphas and the men were even more predictable. He asks Caiaphas why he hates Jesus so much, and this is where they kind of get into a little therapy session, to where, it's kind of funny where, Atticus is basically just one of the earliest ever psychologists. He's just going to begin to just psychoanalyzing Caiaphas and basically breaking down all of his trauma and guilt. Because Caiaphas says that Jesus killed his daughter, and Atticus says that he would know if Jesus committed murder. But Caiaphas says, no, Jesus seduced her. And to this, Atticus is well, no, Jesus doesn't really seem like the romantic type. And Caiaphas says, not romantically, but spiritually. And it's one of those things where it's you're kind of getting annoyed with Caiaphas because you're dude, why are you using all these metaphors? Just talk plainly. But Atticus is kind of playing, joking back at this too. But Atticus views Caiaphas' story as just being petty. He says, why are you mad at Jesus if a Roman praetor is the one who killed your daughter? Right? And obviously Caiaphas says, well, she would have never been in that situation if it weren't for Jesus. But Atticus asks why Caiaphas hasn't sought vengeance against the Roman praetor. And Atticus, Caiaphas, he says that instead of facing his guilt like a man, Atticus, right? So, sorry, my notes here are kind of messed up. So Atticus asks why Caiaphas has not sought vengeance against the Roman praetor, and Caiaphas admits, well, I don't really know where he went. He kind of got deposed. I imagine we're going to see him again in season 6. I think he's probably going to be like one of the guards who's like crucifying Jesus or something. That's just kind of my own theory. I think that's probably going to happen. Atticus goes on to say that instead of facing his guilt like a man, Cophny is seeking to shift the blame, which is a fair point. He says that Jesus is simply an easy target, which is funny because it's like he's defending Jesus here. He says that Cophny is making his daughter's death all about himself and that absolutely repulses him. Which is interesting. Like, it was interesting that they had this conversation. I feel like they wanted to have this conversation at some point and they had Atticus do it. But honestly, doing this, like, this wouldn't really actually be a very smart move on Atticus's point, because he's basically saying, dude, what you're doing is wrong. You shouldn't do this. But then in a second, he's about to ask Cophny, to keep on doing it. He's going to be like, yeah, so I want you to keep doing what you're doing. So if you think about it, logically, it does not make sense for Atticus to be calling Cophny out on these things, because it is to his best interest that Cophny continues to be as bitter against Jesus as possible. So I feel like, again, from a writer's perspective, they wanted to have Cophny called out for his stuff, and they wanted to help, from an audience perspective, they wanted to help explain the whole Rhema thing, because there was some big backlash because of the whole Rhema thing, because, like, even for me, I still do not like that episode because of that. Like, honestly, that scene with Rhema's death, to me, it genuinely bothers me. It is the worst point of the entire show. It genuinely bothers me for so many reasons. It is really the only place in the show where I have not defended the writers. To where I might critique things, but usually, like, that's the one thing where I'm like, I don't know if that was the wisest choice. I defend the right to put that in the show, but I just don't agree with it. And so I feel like from a writer's perspective, they did want to give, like, a final commentary on that. And that's really what this was, right? Atticus is saying, Cophny, you're being petty here. You need to, like, chill out. It's just weird that this is coming from Atticus. To me, it seems like this would have been, like, a better thing to have happened later on in the conversation between Cophny and his wife. Because I guess they're just showing that Atticus is pretty, like, I guess from a character perspective, they're showing that Atticus is very objective and very unbiased in how he analyzes things, but he does have his own agendas, right? And so he's able to see that Cophny is just a victim of his own emotions, but he's also willing to just manipulate and use Cophny for his own personal agenda, right? And so I see what they're trying to show us about Atticus, but it kind of works against what Atticus is trying to do, because whenever you're about to ask somebody to continue doing what they're doing, the last thing you want to do is go ahead of time and tell them that what they're doing is stupid and they should stop. It's, you know what I mean? It's like, that's kind of a weird thing to do. But anyways, Atticus says, we can put you to use. He says that he will give Cophny information about Jesus' whereabouts, and he tells him to keep on doing what he is doing and to try to turn the public opinion against Jesus. And in exchange, he will keep holes out of Cophny's hands or feet. In other words, that is a threat, right? So he's basically said, you seem to really like taking care of yourself, hence why you have made your daughter's death all about yourself. Well, if you want to keep taking care of yourself and you don't want to be crucified, you're going to do what I tell you to do. And so that's another way that they kind of justify Atticus telling him, like, you're stupid, but keep on doing stupid things. Well, the easiest way to get a stupid person to keep on doing things they now know to be stupid is by threatening them with crucifixion. And so that's how that conversation basically ends. Basically, Atticus says he's laying down, and he says we're going to wait till morning. And again, sorry, I feel like I'm like pointing out holes in all this. It's kind of weird that they would wait until morning. Other than, I guess you could argue that maybe Atticus wanted to be seen by by Simon Z later on whenever he's leaving the place. But the general premise of this is really weird, because if Atticus was barging in here to interrogate Cophny, it seems really weird that a Roman guard and, like, all of his men would stay inside that same house all night talking to this man. Like, that seems kind of weird. But really, I think the issue is that they had another scene they wanted to do later on, and that was going to have to be during Thursday during the day. And so they're like, okay, let's just have Atticus lay down and sleep. Like, but it's weird. Like, that's why I'm saying, like, these episodes, I like the events individually, but if you think about them, it seems like the writers were stuck. Like, they had to get to, they had to follow this timetable, right? And it's currently Wednesday night. That's whenever Judas is betraying Jesus, and that's where this stuff's happening. And they're like, well, we don't want these next events to happen until Thursday, which is the day of the Last Supper. And so, like, I can appreciate the, like, constraints that they're under. And that's why, even though I'm kind of, like, pointing out these little plot holes and weird inconsistencies, I don't want to come across too harsh against the writers, because I'm not saying I could do any better, right? I'm just trying to point these things out, because I'm just trying to explain why I think these episodes were inherently weaker But again, I'm not saying I know exactly what to do to make them stronger. I'm just pointing out why they're weaker in my head. So we now pick up the next day. It is Thursday morning, and we begin with Malchus in Caiaphas' house, and he is, he's stressed. He's saying, Passover begins in 8 hours, and he is telling the servants to cleanse the place of any leaven, because, it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so they're going around doing that, and then Pilate all of a sudden barges in, and he tries to play the big dog on campus, right? He shows up, and he says, "What do you intend to do with Jesus of Nazareth?" Pilate says that he was already planning on making an example with the zealot, and that was what he was going to do, on Friday. He says, I was already going to make an example with the zealot, and I was going to communicate a message to the people. What are you doing with Judas, Jesus? Because now it seems like you're just trying to mess things up for me. And Caiaphas says that there's a messianic fever, and he needs to bring the temperature down. Pilate says that he wants peace like Caiaphas, but he doesn't like what he is hearing from Caiaphas and all of his people. Caiaphas says that there are layers, thousands of years of theology, tradition, and law that Pilate does not understand, right? To this, Pilate says that he has become too comfortable with the arrangement, and he is beginning to think that he has more power than he actually has. He says, you would do your best to remember that Rome is the one in charge. And ultimately, Pilate says that if Caiaphas goes through with this and tension rises as a result, their alliance is over. And so you do see the tension between these guys really building. All right, then we cut away. And this is where we pick up the next morning with Simon Z waiting outside when Cophny and Atticus exit. So presumably, Simon Z followed them there. He saw them barge in, and then he just waited there all night. That's what I'm saying, where the timeline is kind of weird. But yeah. So he's been waiting out there the whole night, and then he sees them leave. Hold up. Oh, as Atticus is leaving, he pretends like there was a mistake, right? He's like, oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to barge in like that. Which, again, is strange because, if this were just a mistake, it took the entire night to figure out it was a mistake. That's kind of strange. And also, it seems very performative because Romans are not going to apologize. Even if Romans make a mistake, they're not going to apologize. They're going to be like, all right, well, we messed up here, but we don't really care, and you still need to give us stuff. I don't know. That's what I'm saying. Parts of this were just very strange to me. Z follows Atticus, and at this point, Atticus, he asks some of the guards, he says, hey, give me your swords, and they give him 2 swords. And this is, the moment I saw this, I was like, okay, this is where Z is going to get the swords, which we know he brings out during the Last Supper. All right. We cut away from there. We cut back inside to the house where Cophny tells the men that Adonai has blessed and anointed their cause. They begin to quote scripture to justify why their actions are blessed by God. And Naomi, Cophny's wife, is upset by this, and she publicly calls Cophny out. She says, you make a deal with our enemies and call it divine purpose, right? Naomi, basically she goes away, and Cophny says, let me go talk with her. And she tells him that she's leaving. She rebukes him for twisting the scriptures, right? She says, I can't believe you would be in there twisting the scriptures in order to justify the things that you're doing. She says that her daughter is dead, her husband is a shadow, and they are in league with Rome, and she just cannot bear it anymore. Cophny says that Thomas was never worthy, and she says that that is rich coming from him. And that has to bite, right? Because she's like, okay, you think Thomas wasn't worthy for our daughter? She's basically saying, you're not worthy of me, right? Because you are way less of a man than even Thomas was. It's like, oh, shoot, that has to sting coming from your wife. Naomi says that she prays that God will forgive her because she cannot stay and watch hate and guilt. She cannot stay and watch what hate and guilt have turned Cophny into. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like this is going to change Cophny at all. Over the course of the next several episodes, he's still going to keep on the same path, which really is sad, but this is how it is in life sometimes, right? There are some people who go through something really bad and they are willing to push everybody else away from them, right? Usually it involves death, right? One person dies, and because they are so hurt by that one person's death, they really push away everybody else, which to me, that's the sad thing about whenever you unforgiveness and bitterness and resentment. Whenever you choose not to forgive somebody, whenever you push people away, you're basically communicating to them that they are not worthy enough of your love, and you would rather them be dead to you than be willing to set aside your own pride and forgive them or engage with them or love them. That to me is so sad. But that's what Caiaphas is doing here. And he's just lost in his anger and his frustration and his hatred. And even though Atticus has called him out on it, he's still locked in on doing it. And it's just because he's just focused on himself. And so Naomi says she is leaving. We cut back to Simon Z. He's following Atticus, and Atticus is standing there waiting for him outside a jail cell, or just like a jail compound or area. He says, "Hello, Simon." And they reveal that they're at a jail cell, and they begin to talk. And Z says that he knows the Caiaphas thing wasn't a mistake. Which, again, I don't really know why they presented it like it was one, because Z was the only one who was there to hear it, and it seemed very performative to where Z knew it wasn't a mistake. And then later on, you're going to have Caiaphas' men going around doing stuff, and there's going to be publicly speaking with the Romans, handing them information in later episodes. So it seems weird to me. Like, I don't know who they were performing that for. It just seems kind of strange. And I'm not totally sure what Z's goal was in following Atticus. Like, I don't know. To me, it seems like certain conversations, like from a writer's perspective, certain conversations needed to happen. And they wanted Z to get the swords, and they wanted us to meet Barabbas and stuff. So like, that's what I'm saying. Like the episode to me just felt very much like the writers were constrained. And again, I empathize with that. I do not think I could do it better. But to me, it's like that's just a necessary drawback of this season. There were certain things that they needed to accomplish. And whereas in previous seasons, they're like, hey, we've got time to flesh this out, and we can like introduce these characters, and it doesn't feel forced. To me, there were a lot of things in this episode which just felt forced. It was like, okay, we want these two people to have an interaction, and everything we're going to do needs to just get us to that interaction, but none of it doesn't feel very realistic, to where to me, it felt like this was almost like a theatrical production, which it is, right? But it's not supposed to feel like that when you're watching it. To me, it more felt like, I need these two characters to meet and talk, and therefore I'm going to just like have them meet and talk, right? It's like, okay, like, I don't know. Like, that's why to me, this episode felt a little bit weaker. And really, I'm going to have these issues with pretty much each of these episodes. And I feel bad that I'm coming across so critical, because like I said, I'm enjoying the scenes themselves, but from a narrative perspective, it just doesn't work as like a cohesive story as much. And again, I don't know how I can do it better. I'm just analyzing this as somebody who, analyzes the stuff. And so Z says that he knows the Caiaphas thing was not a mistake. And Atticus says that he came to the jail cell to question a zealot. And sure enough, it is one of Z's old friends who we have seen before, whenever, some of the zealots came to track down Z in Capernaum. And here we learn the guy's name, and Z says, Barabbas. And so turns out we had actually met Barabbas before, and we didn't even know it. Crazy. And so this is going to be a guy who we're going to see again in season 6. I can guarantee it, because if not, that would be strange, to say the least. Atticus says that Barabbas is scheduled for execution in 24 hours, which really serves to remind you that the events of the next season are coming up pretty quick, right? I mean, like, again, by the time this season ends, Jesus is less than 24 hours away from death, right? He's really close to like 16 hours away from death, which was just pretty crazy if you think about it. Z says that Barabbas saw things that should have made him leave the zealot party, and this is where Atticus says, oh, what, you wish you could have saved him? And then he says, no, he saw enough. He should have been able to save himself, right? He should have repented. Because remember, Barabbas was there and he saw Jesus perform miracles, and he saw Jesus do things that were just unexplainable. Z responds to Atticus and says, well, I don't know why you led me here, because no jail cell can hold the Messiah. And Atticus responds and says, what about your friends? And to this, Atticus just throws 2 swords on the ground, and he says that Z can take them if he thinks he might need them. And again, this seems like such a weird thing to do, because that's what I was saying. It seemed very predictable to me whenever Z is there following Atticus, and Atticus tells the soldiers, oh, hey, I need 2 swords. Well, since we know that Z has swords later on, we're like, oh, okay, these are going to become the swords. Now the question becomes, how is he going to get the swords? Well, Atticus is going to give them to him. And it works from a character level, because Atticus is a cocky son of a gun. And of course, like, he's like, I don't care if these people have swords. Here, take these swords. But it's just strange, because it's like, okay, why did Atticus ask for those 2 swords in particular from the men? Because there were more than 2 soldiers there. And why did he want, like, I don't know, like it just seems strange to me, to where it's like, again, they wanted to get these swords to Simon Z, and they wanted Z to have this conversation with Atticus, and so they're like, oh, let's just blend it together. I don't know. There might be something deeper to that, but I don't know. So he says, luck happens when preparation meets opportunity. And with that, he departs. In Z, he picks up the swords, and beneath the swords, you notice that there's a Sika dagger, which he is tempted to take, but he does leave that behind, which tells us that while Z is thinking proactively, and he is wanting to provide here, and he does want to be ready for battle, he is not willing to return to his old ways, right? And so that's a good little beat of a little story arc thing. All right, we now cut to our final scene of the episode, where we see Nicodemus studying Jesus' quotations, comparing them to prophecy, and he is making connections. I'm not totally sure what the connections were, because all the different quotations and stuff that he was reading did not at all seem connected. They were all messianic, but it wasn't like there was so there's a practice in Jewish theology called stringing pearls, right? Stringing pearls is whenever you basically, like Paul does this a lot in like the book of Romans, where you quote one scripture and then all of a sudden you just like start tying a bunch of scriptures together just because they have like a connective tissue. Whereas Nicodemus is not quite stringing pearls here, but he does have his whole like, it's kind of funny, like his conspiracy theorist like set up in the, like on the wall where he's got like all the strings and stuff attached, which I just thought was kind of funny. But yeah, he's quoting a bunch of stuff. Some of the stuff he's quoting is from Jesus' teachings. Some of them are from the prophecies in the Old Testament, but he's not like quoting them in an order that makes like a logical sense, right? He's quoting stuff about him being born in Bethlehem, but then he's also quoting stuff about I and the Father being one, and he's quoting stuff about Isaiah, to where like it doesn't all like line up, but he's just quoting a bunch of stuff, and you get the idea that a lot is going on in his head, right? It's almost like he's like the things that he's saying is just like 1% of what's actually going on in his head, but he is making some really good connections and he's arriving at a lot of understanding about Jesus. At this point, Yusuf barges in, right? Joseph of Arimathea, as we have good reason to believe that's who he is. Yusuf barges in, and he says that Caiaphas is making plans to arrest Jesus. Nicodemus says that Caiaphas doesn't have the authority to arrest people, and Yusuf says that there is a collaborator, and he admits that not all the followers of Jesus agree on who Jesus is. Nicodemus points out that it's illegal for a capital offense to be tried on the evening of a high holy day, but Yusuf says that Annas plays a part in it. And again, we're not introduced to Annas at all in the season, other than in name only. And I like how much they're building him up, because we're going to meet him in season 6. And it's kind of cool how they built him up. Like, to me, it almost feels like if Caiaphas is Darth Vader, then like Annas is like Emperor Palpatine, where it's like he's really the puppet master pulling the strings in the background. And the fact that we haven't seen him makes it that much cooler, to where I don't know who they're going to cast for this guy, but they've got to make sure he has a powerful screen presence, because if he doesn't have a powerful screen presence, it's going to fall very flat, because they've built up Annas a lot. And historically speaking, Annas was quite a big deal, to where I actually really like what they've been doing with Annas throughout the season. So Yusuf says Annas plays a part in it. Yusuf asks if Nico will help him and Shimon in the Sanhedrin. And Yusuf warns that they are planning to, that the Sanhedrin is planning on citing a loophole to label Jesus as a national crisis to justify trying him so late at night, even on the evening of a high holy day, right? He basically says that there's a rabbinic tradition that allows for this. And I haven't looked into whether or not that tradition is legitimate, but it probably is. The writers are good at doing the research. Yusuf, he's talking, he says that the people were not ready for Jesus, and he says present company included, to which Nicodemus says, me or you? And Yusuf says, both. And I kind of like that, right? Like, the idea is that what we know about Yusuf and Nicodemus, both in the show and in the context of Scripture, if Yusuf is Joseph of Arimathea, is that these guys were unified by them, like they were both worshiping Jesus in secret. And the different Gospels, they have different opinions about these guys, because Nicodemus is only mentioned in the Gospel of John, but Joseph of Arimathea is mentioned in the other ones too. And different Gospels come across differently about him. Some of them respect him for, following Jesus, even in secret. Whereas like John is very critical. And he says, yeah, these guys follow Jesus in secret. And then it wasn't until he died that they finally came out publicly. But I like that we see that here in the show, right? To where it says, yeah, we weren't ready for this, present company included. And he says both of us, right? Like, we were not, like, as much as we want to honor God, we were not ready for this. To where it's almost like Yusuf is kind of admitting that they haven't been handling this perfectly, or at least that's what I got out of it. I don't know if that's how y'all interpreted that. Nicodemus says that if they disclose their allegiance now or ever, they will be kicked out of the Sanhedrin discussions. And this again lets you know that Nicodemus is a conflicted man. To where he said, like there's a legitimate possibility with him where he thinks that they might not ever be able to reveal their devotion here, which shows that you're not actually devoted to Jesus. Like, if you're not willing to boldly come out, you're not devoted to Jesus. You're devoted to your position in the Sanhedrin, right? You've got to be willing to give that up. But he's not willing to, right? And you can see how he could justify this because he's saying, well, they need an inside man. But the thing is, Jesus doesn't need your help, right? But that's what we do a lot of times too, right? We justify our sin and our lack of boldness in our faith by being like, oh, well, this is the wise thing to do. No, you've got to live for Christ, right? And so you again get to see that Nicodemus is that same character from season 1 where he believes, but he's not giving it his all. And that is consistent, again, with Scripture. So he says that they'd be kicked out of Sanhedrin discussions. Yusuf asks why Nicodemus brought in Mary Magdalene if he is so unconcerned. He says, okay, well, if you're just willing to let all this stuff happen, why'd you bring in Mary Magdalene? Nicodemus says that he can't stop anything, but he can warn the followers. But again, this is silly because they already know that there's danger, right? Like, really, the issue is that he's caught between a rock and a hard place, right? He is not willing to choose a side. And that's what he's not really willing to admit, right? He wants to feel like he's being faithful to Jesus, but he's not, right? And that's really the heartbreaking thing about Nicodemus here. We really want him to just come out in boldness, and later on he will, but not in this episode. Yusuf says that he will honor Nicodemus's wisdom, but he thinks that they need to participate in the discussion tonight, right? Nicodemus says, I have no idea what will happen tonight, to which Yusuf says, let's find out. And with that, the episode comes to an end. Like I said, not the strongest episode of the show to me. I think that the individual parts are better than the sum of their whole, right? I think that the individual scenes are done really well, but whenever you actually just think about them, it doesn't hold together as well. But I did enjoy the episode, right? And I will say that I think I enjoyed this episode more than I actually enjoyed episodes 1 and 2, even though I would say that episodes 1 and 2 to me were actually stronger episodes, just from a consistency level and just a structural level and stuff. I think that those were stronger episodes, but I think I like this one more just because the rising stakes. Whereas I think episodes 1 and 2, just because they were setting up the season, they were just a little bit slower, right? And so I think that even though I think those were probably stronger episodes and paced better, I think that this episode I just enjoyed more just because you feel the tension building up to where these 3 episodes really do feel like one long finale. And that's another thing. I haven't even mentioned this, but in addition to them being limited by the structure of each, like the timeline, you got to realize that it's very evident within these episodes that not only do they have 8 individual episodes in the season, but there are also 3 sets of episodes to where whenever they wrote this, they weren't you can tell that they wrote it with the intention of episodes 1 and 2 being seen together, episodes 3, 4, and 5 being seen together, and then episodes 6, 7, and 8 being seen together, right? And so there's just a lot of stuff within this that to me, it kind of works against the show being at its best. Which is why I really liked part 2 a whole lot, because to me, those episodes, it probably just because they were in the middle, right? They were in the middle of the season to where they weren't having to set up a bunch of stuff and they weren't having to wrap up a bunch of stuff. They were just able to breathe, right? And so I think that the part 2 episodes, they felt the strongest because they felt the most like the earlier episodes of the show where everything was able to breathe. Whereas I think the beginning and the end of the season, you really feel them trying to set a lot of stuff up and then wrap a lot of stuff up. And the plot just, to me, it suffers as a result. But yeah, I still think the episode was good. And I feel like I criticized it way more than I intended to. But really, I'm just trying to kind of voice these things out loud. And like I said, this is simply me sharing my thoughts about this episode. This is not my in-depth breakdown. Later on, we will come and we'll do breakdowns where we just talk about what's biblical, what's historical, what's fictional. And in those things, I won't really be critiquing the show as much. I'll simply be talking about it. But this is me just sharing my thoughts and my review as a moviegoer, right? And so there are my thoughts. I would like to hear yours. And if there's any plot holes or something that I pointed out that you actually could answer to make me help like the episode better, I would love to hear those from you. But until next time, my name is David Tate. This is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. And of course, remember who you are. Bye.